A lot of work on mapping and really is explored the length and depth and breadth that mapping can take you. And I think that you now have explored the city, hopefully, to a certain extent. We got you out there. I hope you had a good time. And now is a time to think about what you learned and to focus on one aspect or feature or phenomenon that you found particularly compelling. And the next assignment is to build a map or around that topic, that feature, that phenomenon, that experience, and to show that phenomena spatially. How you do that is the topic of Professor Newman's lecture, and we thank her very much for this. This is sort of beyond the call of duty, but I appreciate it. So, shall we go? I think are we good? Yes. I mean, how many of these guys do you have now in theories too?
I've had most of you in theories too. I have some of you in my class, my mapping class right now. I'm seeing a few, and then some even in my other class. So I should know all of you. Yes. Not yet. I think so. Good. I thought that was a good yes. It's all authentic. So I'm going to do this. I'm giving you basically the same talk that I recently gave at a workshop on mapping. So it's a kind of condensed version of what is a much longer, could be in fact a whole semester's worth of work, or what could be a lifetime's worth of work in terms of trying to understand how mapping works and what maps are supposed to do. But my goal with you guys is to get you up and running quickly, right? So that you can take the kinds of observations that you hopefully made or started to make about a place and begin to understand how to calibrate them. That's the first thing you need to know how to do, is to calibrate, and then how to instrumentalize them. That is how to turn them into something that you can actually use. So my reason for starting to do this a long time ago now, this was my thesis work, in fact, as a master's student that is now kind of blossomed into a number of other things, but to really understand the issue of what I now have come to call data visualization, which is essentially what this is to make you more able, let's put it that way, to use maps constructively in design. That's really the goal for me with designers. So I'm not trying to make you, you're not social scientists. I just want to be clear here because I'm going to show you a lot of different kinds of maps. You're not social scientists, you're not engineers, you're not biologists. So I'm not asking you to do the same kinds of things with mapping that they would do. But the concept of mapping, the procedure of mapping is shared in every discipline as a way in which we organize our analyses, the way in which we organize the kind of observations that we've made. So go for it. There are two kinds of human communication at the very basic. One is language. I can tell you where I live, go down this street, take 36, take a right, go left here, right? Or I can do what seems to be also fundamental to our communicative strategy, which is I can draw a map for you. Go here, go there, do this, right? So these two ways of communicating have apparently been with us quite a while, at least 10,000 years that we know of for language, if not longer, back to almost 60,000 years now with graphic language, right? With a way of describing something that happened to me or something that I witnessed. There's usually the eyewitness account, and then putting that down in some way that you could come along and say, oh, she saw a gazelle. She saw that. There are buffalo here. They're this here, right? So it's a form of communication. So we've been doing it for a long, long time. Which is to say, don't get confused with some kind of, it's not like they keep getting better through history. Pretty much we keep revisiting the same kinds of techniques again and again. What has changed and what's significant is that because of the computer, we can process a lot more data, right, in a much shorter amount of time. That has changed, and that has impacted the mapping procedure. This is two examples of the same condition. I'm going to show you sort of generally different kinds of maps. Then I'm going to give you the terms of the map, the conditions that have to be present in order for you to know that you have a map or to approach making a map. And then I'm going to go back and show you different maps and talk about the way those terms play out, okay? But the first thing to understand is that the map is not about reality. I'll say this again. The map is not about reality, okay? So don't think that when you're making the map, it'll be incredibly boring if you think that you're making the map in which you're describing the absolute condition the way it is. I could ask you to go out into the parking garage, of which we have many, pick one, right, and ask you to map all the red cars. And you would come back and say, Fairly, I've mapped all the red cars. I'm like, great, now what? Right? And is that true? Have you really mapped all the red cars? Did you map all the red cars that were just purely red? Or did you map the red cars that were 90% red? You could keep, right, we could keep going back. By the time you keep going back, that situation would have changed. It's a constantly shifting reality, it's constantly shifting, right? At a certain point, you probably drew those cars in their slots straight. Is that true? No. They're probably all wacky. This one's a little off, this one's parked that way, this one's that way. Do you understand? There's an old, a very beautiful poem or story, short story by Borges, in which the Chinese emperor has asked for China to be mapped at a 1-to-1 scale. And of course, they make this beautiful map, which is the size of the country, and then generations go by, and they get tired of updating and keeping track of it, and the map becomes tattered, and pretty soon they're just back to the country. In other words, it's never right. You can't map 1-to-1 at the country. It is the country. Do you understand? There was no, it's an impossible condition. This is a great example of exactly how bizarre this can be. So the Mercator projection, the one here on the left, is the one that you're probably the most familiar with. It's the one that you get in elementary school. This is the world as you know it. That's not the world. Actually, it's just a representation of the world. In fact, it's just the representation of a world. There are many, many ways that I could map or project a map of the world map. This is just one of them. Mercator is a 16th century cartographer. He's Dutch. The Dutch are conquering the world. This is when they're colonizing. They're getting, going to Haiti and getting rum and sugar cane. And they're coming to the Americas, right? They're getting resources, people, things, basically. And so their interest is in sea navigation. That's how they're really moving around the world. So this map is great if you're a navigator on a ship, because you can put a straight line down on the map, and there's the least amount of distortion possible in the oceans. Yes? So I can figure out the distance the most carefully on the ocean. It distorts the landmass terribly. The landmass is not particularly accurate. And you can see that difference when you look at the Gall-Peters projection here on the right, which is actually more accurate for landmass. So that's actually much closer to what the landmasses look like. Big difference. It means that France is not where you think it is. Germany is not the shape that you think it is. And by God, Latin America is huge. Yeah? And sub-Saharan Africa? Whoa. Now, the UN doesn't want to particularly adopt this. They talked about it, but of course, the 5 powers at the top, who all own territory that looks big here, don't want that to be the projection that's used. Because remember, territory is power. I don't care what generation or century you're in. You remember this game as children. MySpace. That MySpace deal, still a big deal. So if my property looks that much smaller than your property, i.e. the United States looks, at least a little, like almost a quarter smaller, right? Basically up there. I don't really want to look like that to the world. And it makes Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa look as big as they actually are landmass-wise. Well, that's just not the way I want to be perceived. So, maps are often, right? They're both accurate, by the way. Both follow under the term accurate. They both describe a different condition. Neither map describes the absolute. because I can make tons of different projections of the Earth, and they're going to all look different. Does this make sense? So it's really important that you understand that when you're out mapping your observation, it's not about accuracy. It is about measurement, by the way. The measured part of this is really important. If it didn't have that grid on it, it would just be a sketch of that situation, and that's not a map. A map and a sketch are not the same thing. It's not your impression, it's your measured impression. The measurement is key. Lord Kelvin said that you can't know anything about something you haven't measured. Go forward. So, just to give you a sense, here's a great map of basically rain charts. Now, is that true? Yes, that's average rainfall, blah, blah, blah. Is that exact? Is the difference between one light line, one dark line precise? No, right? It's a thematic map in which the theme is rainfall across the United States. The idea is that I can look at this representation, I can look at this mapped condition, and I can get a sense for, right, where the rain is and where it's not. That's its utility. It's not supposed to be for, can I sit down and measure it? So this is an absolutely valid way to map something, where you're using measurement, but you're not, it's actually relational. I've given it hierarchy. Darker versus lighter means more rain versus less rain. And it gives me a general understanding of that condition. Go forward. Here, this one you can go online and see. It's really quite beautiful. This is the wind map across the United States at any given moment. It's a real world mapping that's updated live based on NOAA feedback, right? Oceanic, the weather guys basically reporting what they're getting from satellites, goes directly into this live feed, and this thing moves all the time. So it's in constant motion. So it's a mapping of the winds in real time. The data that's going into the map is the wind information, right? The frame is the United States, and the winds in the United States. I'm not looking at the winds in Russia. It's a different map. And it's measured because it's taking the data directly right from what's being reported from the satellites. And it's translating those into this quite astounding and quite beautiful graphic. I cannot tell you. It's worth looking at. It's this constant, Van Gogh painting of the United States, basically, in the wind. Go forward. Here, one of my favorite maps from the early, an early map. These are the ways in which the routes of the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi, you think it's just there, like that's the river, it's always been there. No, in fact, the Mississippi moves. It's like a snake across the landscape. It's always shifting, right? So over a 200-year period, 300-year period, this river, yeah? And this map captures that through time. That's actually one of the functions that we're going to talk about that has to be present in the map. All maps in one way have time. This one happens to be a map of something that happens through time. The map maker has used the different colors, basically, in order to indicate those routes and to indicate when they occur. And the key in the map will explain that for you. This is a series of one of 7 maps all along the Mississippi. So it's only a portion of the Mississippi River. Go forward. Okay. This, also a map. Again, remember I'm just giving you a sense of what maps are, what kinds of maps there are. This is actually a map that records, these are the Gilbraiths who are looking at, they're kind of from the Taylorist family of thought, in which you're trying to look at how long it takes for someone to perform a particular action. In this case, the folding of a napkin. So what they do is they record that using the camera, or film in their case, and then the dotted lines, they go back, and they tell you from frame to frame, in effect, they dot out, right, what that action was. And what they're trying to do is find efficiencies. So there'll be tons of these. Go forward. I don't think I show you many more. These are actually a mathematician who is trying to come up with a mathematical model for emotions. So these are emotions if you could diagram them or map them, sorry, they're not diagrams, we just had this discussion in my class, these aren't diagrams. If you could map them, basically to map different kinds of emotions, so love, hate, so on and so forth. It's quite beautiful. So it's to say, I'm showing you this because I want you to understand that qualitative data can be understood quantitatively, and quantitative data can actually be translated into qualitative maps. It doesn't, maps are indifferent to the kind of data forward. This, does anyone know what this is? It is. Do you know which one? Watson and Crick. Make it helpful? It's human genome. It's DNA. Yeah, so this is the double helix. They actually couldn't figure this out. They had a kind of mapping, which was they knew that there were certain nucleic acids that formed proteins, that formed the basic building blocks. They couldn't figure out what their structure was, what relations, how they were framed, what the framework was. And they had a woman in the lab who'd taken a series of quite detailed photographs. She's rarely credited, but she's actually the first person to have really observed that there was some kind of double helix structure. And in order to understand if that was true, they had to build the model. They actually had to model it to figure it out. So it's a map, that's a model. Models can also be maps, as long as they have that measured, right, that sort of thing. In fact, all of your drawings are maps, by the way, because all of your drawings, except for sketches, isometric projections, so the axons, all of those, ethnographic projections, plans, right, all of the drawing types, section, plan, elevation, they're all maps because they use measurement to describe a situation. Right? So if you think about it this way, it becomes quite clear. You have a site plan, you redraw the site plan with your building in it, that's a new map. Right? You're projecting something using the map. Go forward. This is one, it's a beautiful model. Okay. So there are 5 operative terms. I keep changing the way I think about this. This would be fine for you guys. I now call it 4 terms and 2 functions. We'll use the 5 operative terms. You're going to get the same thing either way. For those guys in my class, do what we talk about in class, but it's the same idea. So the first term that every map has to have is a frame. You have to draw something around the thing you want. So I have to say, here, everything that I want to look at is in here, everything else is out there. Yeah? And I'm only going to look at the stuff in here. This is what I want you to look at. So the DNA map puts the frame. What are you looking at when you look at the DNA of the human genome?
The build model.
A human. Who said it? Yeah, just a human. That's the frame. That's exactly right. So it's not a, gerbil. The human genome is for the human. It's the only thing that I want you to look at is the human being when I map that. If I want to look at gerbils, it's a different map. They have similarities, but it's a different world. It's the equivalent of saying, here's the Earth and here's Mars. You don't get those confused. So make sure that, or I hope not, make sure that the frame, you're clear what the frame is. This is what I want you to look at. If you go to the site and you want me to look at snails, don't draw the cars. The cars probably have nothing to do with the snails. Your frame is all the snails. Does this make sense? Don't underestimate this. You guys flip frames all the time. You're pointing to this, and you're talking about that, and you actually mean this. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know where the frame is. Do you understand? I don't know what you framed. Okay? It's not interchangeable. Once you pick this, you have to stick. That's the frame. That's what I'm drawing. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm thinking about. The second term is relative scale, which is really projection. I really always talk about this as projection, which is the grid. I have to control the relationships in some way in the space of the map. If you think about it this way, it's a world example that I'm going to give you. Remember I said not every map will have every term, so the human genome has a different kind of projection. It has one, but it works differently. But typically you're going from 3D to 2D, i.e. I'm trying to map something out here, and I'm trying to put it in a 2D. So if you think about it, I can't do, if the world's like this, I have a very basic problem. It exists like this in 3D, and I have to flatten it. Which means I have to have some way of doing that. I have to do something with that. And we use projection or a drawing for a technique. It's math, actually, it's all math. We use math to do it. So axonometric is math. Perspective is math. Do you understand? You're saying this is 18 inches. This, right, represents 18 inches in this system of measurement. Do you understand? So I'm taking one thing and I'm representing it using another system. Usually we use projection, and there are rules within each kind of projection. So if you're working in, one kind of projection technique, you can't suddenly switch and say I want to do another. So let's just do it this way. You're making an elevation, and then all of a sudden you're making a perspective, and I'm like, you kind of have to decide. Now, you can do a little bit of perspective in your elevation. You can consciously frame that out, but you have to do that. You can't just suddenly switch. Because one assumes that all the light rays are parallel, i.e. axonometric, isometric, and one assumes they're converging. One makes me think like I'm floating over it from any viewpoint, any of 100 possible million viewpoints, and the other makes me feel like I'm there. So don't talk to me about your experience of the site and show me a plan. Right? Plan has nothing to do with the experiential quality of the site. That makes sense? Don't talk to me about this sort of spatial configuration in a precise way and point me to a perspective. Perspective is all relative distances. And the one you learn doesn't even manage to deal with anything that isn't rectilinear. You never draw the person in perspective, you just put them in the perspective, don't forget. Right? So you're not even managing to draw complex curves in perspective, you're just approximating those. So it's a very specific tool. It will only do certain things, it won't do others. If you misuse the tool, it means you don't understand what you're mapping. Okay. So that one will help you understand then the third term, which is the axes of translation. So I can either be here looking over it, like I'm flying in an airplane, right, which tends to be planimetric. Elevation works the same way because I assume that there's an infinite number of points of view, yes, right? Then I can also be this way to it, which means that I'm more in the scene. Google Map is beautiful for this now. Google Earth does this, right? You're looking at the Earth, you go up to it, and then all of a sudden you feel the plane actually tilt, right? And you're in the straight view. And there's that, I love to play like in that half zone. I'm always trying to like stay in that half zone as long as possible. I don't think Google Earth likes me very much. I keep breaking it. Anyway, you know what I mean? This is like, but that half zone is really that weird. I love that place where the Earth isn't quite, still, it's flat, not quite flat, it's not quite tilted. So that is actually right at the break of the axes of translation. In one axis, I feel like I'm in the world, and everything is like zoomy and I'm there, and it's from my point of view. In the other one, I could be a speck of dust floating above the Earth. No point of view at all. I'm completely anonymous in the view. Does that make sense? So depending on what you want to convey, you need to make sure that you pick the right axes of translation. Photographs are maps, by the way, because I'm not just looking at the scene, I'm looking at the scene using the lens. The lens is selecting the frame, right, what I see and what I don't, and the amount of, right, the coverage of the lens is selecting the frame. Does this make sense? So we don't tend to think of them that way, but they actually are a kind of mapping procedure. We don't use them that way. So if you just use it as an image of something, I'll buy it as an image. But if you point out that it's a photograph and that it operates this way, you can actually use it as a map as well. You just have to point to it so that I know that that's how you're using it. So then the next one is the index. This is a little hard because index is the thing, so there's this idea in mathematics of correspondence, and it's probably, I think, the easiest way to explain the index. I take things that are in category A, and I need to compare them to things in category B, and I need to index that in order to make that happen. So I want to know how many, I want to know what blue, I want to understand, the differences of different kinds of blue eyes, so then I have to have notions of blue, and then I also have to have groups of people with blue eyes, and I have to compare the two, so that I can see, right, along some scale, what those are. I mean, you can index all sorts of things. Descartes Dupont, which I think I'll show you, which is the map of love, indexes love, right? It makes a map of the different kinds of things that can happen in a relationship as you get close, far apart, right? It's about a year long, the process of sort of falling in love in the map. And it will index, the idea is love, it indexes the different conditions, and it compares them to a landscape that you have to traverse. So it makes a landscape. Yeah, I know I've shown, I forget which class I show what. But because I only have like so many things in my toolbox. That's one of my favorites for maps. Yeah.
So a part of indexing is all these variations and series of things that can amount from this kind of comparison, cataloging?
No, it's simpler than that. The index is just the legend. The index tells me, the map reader, what you, the map maker, wants me to compare to what. So in the map, if it doesn't have topo lines, it's not a topographic map. So if you draw the topo lines, you're sort of telling me I'm indexing the relative heights and depths of that surface. Does that make sense? So you're using that to point to this. They're not equivalents. They're not the same thing, but they point to each other, basically. Language does the same thing. Sweater is the word for that warm fuzzy thing that you wear. It points to it. I could also call it something different. I could call it dog. You wouldn't believe me because I'd be misusing the map, but I could do that. Oh, she's wearing a dog. I really like the dog that you've got on. Gosh, that looks like an expensive dog that you're wearing. Pretty soon you're like, well, she's got a problem, but I think she means my sweater. But it would be me misusing the index, because the index is fixed in our language. Sweater means warm, fuzzy thing that you wear, not your dog. Does that make sense? So index is an important, well, as we go forward, and so every map pretty much has an index. This is one of those characteristics that it may not be super forward in the map, but it's probably there somewhere. Then there are two other, I actually have two terms now that I use as functions. One of them is time, and the other is called the neutral domain or context. I think for this presentation I decided I'd stop at 5, but there are really two more. Time, which can be in the map, of the map. Time plays out in all sorts of ways, and then in the neutral domain, we'll talk about that too, is the sort of blank space that you need to know what everything else is. Go forward. We're not going to do this, because this is, I keep forgetting this is in here, but basically there is a process of sort of data collection, data analysis, and then sort of the implementation. For us, it's not, I love the fact that this diagram, and I forget how fixed, how precise this looks. And actually, the whole thing about the maps is that you can make it, they can be very precise or very imprecise. But the procedure is very much the same, where you have a kind of, you collect the data, basically, and then you're going to have to derive some kind of mathematical, this is really too clever, relationship, and then you're going to have to implement that in some way. That's the basic procedure. Go forward. Go forward. So actually go back. Let's do this. So just keep in mind that there's a kind of data space always. This is always true. In other words, all those red cars, that's the data space. Yeah? Red cars in the garage. That's the frame. The index red cars. So there's data. There are 502 red cars, and there are 5 sort of red cars, and one that used to be a red car but isn't a red car anymore. Does that make sense? That's the data space. That can be whatever. I can manage that. Like that's separate. That's just a bunch of information. it's not really mapped until I link it to the geographic space. The geographic space is the spatial kind of glue that sort of makes that meaningful. So it's in that garage. They're located this way to each other. What if it turns out that all the red cars are parked together? Like all the people who drive red cars are part of a secret society of people who drive red cars. Total conspiracy, right? They all see themselves as super hot, super sexy. Do you know what I'm saying? I drove a red car. You drove a red car? We're part of the same club. We all park in the red garage together. You get the meaning, right? I've got a little lapel pin. We have meetings every Friday night, 2 o'clock. See what I'm saying? Now, I may map that relationship and discover, oh, that's weird. They're all parked together. I wonder why they're all parked together. And I go look up more data. I go look up more stuff. It turns out they're a secret society. Do you see what I mean? This is how they found Capone. This is how they found Al Capone, right? The mail. They got him with the mail. It was just a mapping procedure. He's sending all these things, all these, right? What's going on? So these, you just keep, but that, until I go, oh, they're all parked together in that space, they're just a bunch of red cars. Do you see the difference? They're just 500 red cars out there with 7 possibly, right, and 1 that used to be but isn't anymore. And you don't know any more about it until I put it in some context or space. And then you have to convey that, and then you need to convince, oh, look what I've discovered. All the red car people, they belong to this secret club. Okay, so same thing. Here's just a sample, soil sample, in which you can see the distribution. That's what this is, just the distribution. Very, very small, this kind of soil sample shows you the distribution, in this case, of potassium in that soil sample. We all knew there's potassium in the soil. We just didn't know exactly where it was in the soil. So the map shows you where it is. That's very important. That can be very useful information to understand. Go forward. This, one of my favorite maps for all my mapping guys, you've seen this a lot. Basically, this is one of the most complicated maps in terms of an index that's ever been made. This is Charles Minard, a great French cartographer in general. And his question was, why did Napoleon fail in Moscow? Why did all those people die? Now, he didn't ask this question until 1863, which is a good deal of time, almost 50 years past the 1812 occurrence. He didn't want to lose his head. You don't want to pick up Napoleon. So he's got to ask it at the right time. So that matters too. Like, we know that he asked this later. In retrospect, right? It's a strategy question. The answer turned out to necessitate that he actually mapped multiple things together, that he looked at multiple data sets. One was, what was the trajectory? Where did they go? So at the top you see, there's Spain, Paris is there, all the way over, that's where they were going, right? So you see the kind of, again, you can't measure this by distance, but you see the path that they followed. Then he was like, so how many guys started out? It was mostly guys. How many guys, how many soldiers were there in the troop? And he does something which is called a choropleth, which is where you take a graphic and you make it mean something. So the width of the graphic means the number of people. It's about 400,000. That's what that means. When you look down at the key, it will tell you that. He describes it. So then he says, okay, about 400,000 people started. What happened, right, as they go along, you can see that the line diminishes. Some troops went this way, some went that. They don't all go the same way. They come back, they end up with about 4,000 people at the end. That's the black line. So start, finish. That's a lot of people that didn't make it back. So what happened? Well, it turned out that they were doing not so badly on the way over, not so great. They wouldn't have been fantastic, but they really got completely decimated on the way back. And they actually start losing significant enough people on the way. So the question is, well, why? Well, it turned out that when you plot it against the weather, it turns out that it is truly the Russian winter that is a killer, combined with the fact that all the Russian troops slash and burn as they retreat. So that's why you start losing people. Basically, winter's coming as they're going. Napoleon was told this, by the way, multiple times. People advised him, don't do it. The Russians know their winter, which they do. So as they're going forward, the Russian troops are retreating, slashing and burning, no food, people are starving, getting colder, colder, colder. They're in Moscow, the Russians close the door, we're starving, 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 but we know what to do for the winter. winter. We know you guys won't make it longer than we will because we're used to it. Miami was totally at loss. I forget this, I'm going to do a party. I'm not going to hang out in a Russian winter. I don't think I can do it anymore either, come to think of it. So, right, so they're like, the Russians are like, yeah, we just know if we wait long enough. Finally, the French are like, this is not going well. We're going to go home. By that time, the temperatures are really dropping. Everybody else dies. See the problem? So it's really the Russian winter. So it's indexing temperature, distance, numbers of people, and path and trajectory. That's a lot. Plus, it has time. Because without even realizing it, I've walked you through the whole story of a 9-month campaign. This took 9 months to unfold. And you're seeing that time from left to right, and back in the map. Does that make sense? So time is a big component of this. That's a lot of information to put together to tell the story. What do you do with this? You don't invade the Russians during the winter. Like, this is really useful information to have. Are we good? This is, like, this uses every tool, basically. Go forward. Disney. Right? Go forward. Also Disney. This was one of my students' maps. So this is a procedure, and for those in my mapping course, this will help you with your first assignment, which is the unmapping process. So basically, what you do is go back. The student was given this. This is the guide map that's given. She was asked to then unmap it or remap it in some way while looking at the question of utopia. Remember, Disney presents itself as a kind of little utopia, basically. And the map reinforces that. That's the frame. There's nothing outside of Disney in that map. Yes? It's exactly to the edge of the worlds that are contained in the Disney map. So she said, great, what if the whole world became Disney? Go forward. So this is what she did. She mapped it as one continuous, in this case, commodification, which is what Disney has done, of experience across the world as a kind of dystopia. Does this make sense, right? She's saying, look, the whole world is now Disney, basically. So it's a map, it's a thematic map having to do with the notion of utopia. It takes an existing map and actually just remaps that using her observation about the meaning of Disney in our culture. Go forward. Or this one, another one of my favorites, same map as a base. Now this one mapped every possible experience in Disney as a kind of Rubik cube. So if you said that every side of the cube, every different color is equivalent to every different world in Disney, Fantasyland, right, Future World, blah, 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 and you said, I'm doing this. Every time I go into Disney, I'm throwing the dice as to what experience I'm going to have. That's the map I worked on today. So it's a map, in this case, much like the carte de tendre, it's a map of desires. I went this way today, I took that path, I did this, I went to the bathroom, I got a Coke, I did that. Do you see what I'm saying? So she maps all the possible, she shows you, look, Main Street, Tomorrowland, Fantasy, blah, 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 and here are all the possible, it could be all this sort of stuff. So from 10 and 5 to 11 p.m., that was the particular map that that person used. Now, which came first? The Rubik's Cube thing, and then I followed it, or I had the experience and then I mapped it? Doesn't really matter, right? They're both the same. In the end, one predicts the other. Okay? But what does it do to your brain? What it does to your brain as a designer is all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's something about Disney that I could use. I could think about every experience as a possible sort of mapping experience where I'm controlling the trajectory, where I'm thinking about the experiences that you're having, and by the way, that is the program in the building. So I could actually have you naked eating oysters wearing boxing gloves on the 9th floor. which is what Rem Koolhaas said in Manhattan Transcript, which is the basis for almost all architecture post-1980s, in which you no longer think of the program as simply a description of a series of events, but actually the events in relationship to each other. And you can have multiple event experiences at the same time on the same surface, which is basically what FOA's architecture is all about. Right? You don't use walls, use surfaces. Surfaces manage event experiences. I can be naked, wearing boxing gloves, eating oysters on the 9th floor because I've gone up in the elevator, I got up, did the gym, I then went up, I got up and took a shower, I went up one more, right? And those experiences have stayed in my head. So in my mind, I'm having all these experiences seamlessly. It's kind of like being on an escalator. There's no stopping and starting. You're just sort of moving through the space. That's what most late 20th century architecture does, using surfaces. That's why ramps are so popular. Right? That's why you see surfaces showing up. It's a kind of mapping. It comes from this kind of understanding. If you do this with a place, you can rethink an aspect of architecture in a new way. You can rethink how you approach that project by using a procedure that you've navigated using the map. Does this understand? This is how the maps become utilitarian. You can apply them in some way. And then you tell me this is what you've done, and I'm like, oh, I'm with you. That's great. You've reprogrammed the space using event space, and there's an infinite number of possibilities, and what you're doing physically enables that. Do you see that? Okay, go forward. This one, another one, I'll show you how this works. This is all about time and distance relationships and looking at different maps that do that. So Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion, airplane movement, go forward. Here's the map that the student produced, which is basically the fact that time and space now work differently. So originally, if you look at the top, the perception, the space, the time. This was the time it took to move a good from one part of the world to the other. So it was sort of, right, how long it takes to move from place to place. Here it is in 1900s, that's there. Here it is in today. What's happened? Why is the perception of the world that everything's closer together? What happened? Huh? Why?
Technology.
Yes, which one? Bigger. Plane. Yeah, so the plane, right, we now move everything air, ocean. That's what the Dymaxion world map is about. It reorganizes everything according to air currents, not ocean currents. Go back one. So that's what this map is about. That's the air-ocean map, right? In other words, I've reconfigured the world according to the air currents, not the ocean currents, which was the old way of traveling. Go forward. So this guy said, okay, so that's that, and that's going to be what it is by 2030, that we're even getting closer together. How does that matter for an architect? What it means is that we can displace experience in a different way. I can think about the relationship between time and space in a different way. I can actually engage you in that discussion more actively. I could be in New York, Times Square, watching a video of the New Year's happening in Berlin. That is pretty great. That means that I'm both in a space and in a virtual space at the same time, and they have a relationship, right? So I'm touching this, but I'm seeing that. So I've got a different headspace that's opened up. What if the architecture around me enhanced that in some way? What if the experience that I'm having blurs those boundaries in some way? What if it plays with my mind in some way? And architects love to do this. We've been doing this forever. Think about the Scala Regia, right? And Bernini, and he messes with your mind because he's like, well, that staircase is too short. We're going to have to make it look like it's a lot farther away. So we're just going to force the perspective, because clearly the relationship between heaven and earth cannot be, 30 meters. It's got to be 300 meters. So at least I'm going to make you think it is. Is it? No, actually it's not. Just totally your brain on the stair. Who's got your brain on drugs? Space drugs. Right? So not only am I standing in Times Square, looking at the ball drop in Times Square, and listening to people in German in Berlin, I'm also on my phone with my friend talking about the experience. How many spaces am I occupying? Architecture, right, we can play with this, but you can't play with it until you understand how that's happened, why that's happened. Go forward. Here is a student, actually in Missouri, believe it or not, who had a field trip to